to start.
Yes, sir. Please continue, sir.
So it gives me great pleasure to welcome everybody around the world for this 11th ICID webinar. As you know, under its policy of ICID, we would like to extend our knowledge and disseminate it to the wider public. And the webinar service is one of the tools that we are utilizing to bring different technologies and information to the irrigation and drainage community. And we got two different series, namely the professional series. That is the one that we will be listening today. And then we got a young professional series provided by young professionals in the water sector, particularly working on agricultural water management. And the webinar on negotiations for resolution on transboundary water conflicts is the 9th webinar in the professional series and the 11th webinar of ICID. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you around the world to this occasion, this webinar. A special word of welcome to Ms. Carleen Maywald, who is our presenter, and Secretary General Ashwin Pandya will give some introductory notes about Ms. Carleen Maywald. So look forward, and thank you very much for everyone that joins us this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Felix. It is indeed a great honor to have Carleen Maywald here. I met her in Nepal in our Asian Regional Conference, and the presentation that she gave in the Young Professionals Training Program hooked me almost instantaneously. The interstate and transboundary issues in water are becoming more and more pronounced and are becoming more and more difficult to solve. There are various actions at play. We as engineers used to look at it primarily from the engineering point of view, but then there are so many other angles, political angles, social angles, the perception angles are there which are not adequately taken care of while we are trying to resolve these disputes. And this is the place where I feel that Carleen has a unique way of looking at these problems, which needs to be told to the world and which needs to be propagated, because she has got an insight into the national frameworks and cooperative arrangement that led to change in Australia after a drought. And that drought was the one when she was the Minister for Water Resources in the country between this 2004 and 2010. So I do believe that we have a very enriched and very fruitful webinar ahead, where we will all end up learning a lot from the real type of experience of Carleen Maywald. She is also, till May 2015, she was the chair of National Water Commission, and she was the representative for the seat of SAPI in South Australian House of Assembly from October 97 till March 2010. So, and she has served on numerous national and ministerial councils, including Murray-Darling Basin Ministerial Council, Natural Resources Management Council, Primary Industries Ministerial Council, and Regional Development Ministerial Council. And she is a board member of South Australian Water Corporation, together with the related South Australia Water Board committees. So it is my great pleasure to be here and introduce Carleen and get the opportunity of listening to her enlightening talks once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwin. And I thank ICID very much for the opportunity to present to the world in this very important topic of transboundary issues in relation to water and resolution of the conflicts that can occur. My presentation today will take on a couple of focuses. The first will be the reasons why these conflicts arise and what stages we're at when these conflicts arise, and what sort of tools Australia has over a number of decades to resolve the transboundary water conflicts. So, to firstly set the scene, in Australia, under our constitution, as is the same in many countries, our states or provinces have the responsibility for managing water. In fact, our constitution actually specifically says that our Commonwealth government shall not, by any law or regulation of trade or commerce, abridge the right of the state or of the residents therein to the reasonable use of the waters of rivers for conservation or irrigation. So it's very explicit, and it's a very noble objective. But what it eventuated in reality, on the ground, 100 years after the Constitution was established, was that the states, with the responsibility to manage water, there was no strategic national approach to how we managed water. Local interests superseded the national interest, and local industries and individuals had an expectation of a right to access water. There was no consideration of the downstream impacts of water use or water decisions. There were inconsistent policies and laws to manage water between the different states, and the development of the water resources was at the expense of the environment, which really caused the situation to occur where the security of supply to everyone who depended upon that water became at risk. So the kinds of things that happened in Australia over that period of time was the water resources were over-allocated well beyond the system's capacity to supply. There was stressed and threatened production capacity, so therefore our irrigators and our communities that were dependent upon that water were under stress. There was investment uncertainty. That uncertainty was created as a result of not knowing how much water would be available from season to season, and in an over-allocated resource, there was always conflict over who had access first. There was a threat to the reliability of the water supply and the quality of the water supply. The environment became stressed and endangered. Fish deaths, riverine forests died, floodplains became degraded. The river mouth of the Murray-Darling Basin, our River Murray, actually closed over. Pollution issues were evident with salinity, major blue-green algae outbreaks, acid sulfate soil exposure, and all of that in amongst the mix of conflicts between the state governments with their inconsistent policies and planning, the conflicts between upstream and downstream users, both within states and between states. Our irrigators were in conflict with other industry users and urban users, and urban users were in conflict with everyone. So how do you build capacity and resilience to meet these types of challenges? And there are two approaches that need to be considered concurrently. There's the technical aspect, and as Ashwin pointed out in the introductory remarks, there is the infrastructure and the engineering solutions, but there is also, just as important, the political solutions to get good, long-lasting water reform. So a bit of context for those of you around the world that are not familiar with the Murray-Darling Basin. The Murray-Darling Basin is a very large river basin, over 1 million square kilometres. It's 20% of the Australian mainland and has two major rivers and many, many tributaries. It takes into its area 4 state governments plus 1 government from the Australian Capital Territory. It supports a small population of 3 million people, but it's 75% of Australia's irrigation capacity is within the Murray-Darling Basin, and it's 15 billion Australian dollars in agricultural products. So it's about 40% of Australia's agriculture. It's a highly regulated system, which you'll see in the photograph on the left. That's what used to happen before the building of dams and locks and weirs to regulate the river system, to keep the system basically as a continuous channel of water. In the Murray-Darling Basin, we also see that there are very variable weather patterns, and here's a diagram that shows you over a period of over 100 years, from 1895 through to the end of the Millennium Drought in 2010, the variability in supply. The dotted lines show you the long-term average supply of both the northern and the southern basins. And as you'll see just in the right-hand side, between 1997 and 2010, where the flows into both the Murray and Darling basins were well below average for a period of 10 years. That's what we call the Millennium Drought. And as you can see, if you look back on the historical data, there's always been periods of high flow interspersed with periods of dry flows. So we're actually used to drought in Australia, and we're used to managing drought. But this one was totally unprecedented. So how do we go about managing during that drought, and what were the things that we did leading up to it to enable Australia to manage such an extreme drought prior to what we did prior to the drought occurring that enabled us to manage through it? Right back in the beginning, it took many, many years, from 1982, the signing of the Constitution, to 1914, for there to be an agreement struck between the states on how we would share water between the four states, or the three states in the River Murray initially. It was a multi-jurisdictional agreement that actually built, was the basis on which we built dams, locks and weirs. And its primary purpose for that agreement was for navigation and irrigation purposes, as the River Murray corridor was a very important transport corridor. So there was no consideration of critical human needs, there was no consideration of a whole range of other water quality issues. It was simply a water quantity agreement, and it was based on each state negotiating the best possible outcome. That agreement lasted until about 1981, 1982, when we had a significant and major blue-green algal outbreak within the River Murray system. And that's when water quality became really first on the radar for consideration in managing the Murray-Darling Basin. And the agreement was expanded to include the Darling River and also to establish a Murray-Darling agreement that included for the first time water quality as well as water quantity. Now, this agreement took a long time to negotiate, and it was negotiated in good faith, led by our Australian government, with all of the ministers and the premiers, chief ministers from each of the jurisdictions responsible. We also set up at that time a Murray-Darling Basin Commission to oversee the management of the system and the agreement. That Murray-Darling Basin Commission was made up of commissioners from each of the states, and they included the heads of the government departments for water, agriculture, environment and urban water supplies. So 2 commissioners and 2 deputy commissioners. That agreement lasted right up until 2012. There were some concurrent policy initiatives that happened and were led by the National Australian Government. In 1994, our Australian government had a very strong focus on microeconomic reform to make Australia more competitive in the world as all countries are opening up to a global marketplace. So there were microeconomic reforms, and water got tied up in that. So in 1994, there was a national water reform agenda that looked at the microeconomics of water and started a reform package along the way of introducing proper pricing for water, separating the delivery of services of water from the development of policy from water. So our engineering and water supply departments were actually corporatised and separated out from the policy of government. And a number of initiatives were brought into place to actually bring governments along on a journey of reform towards pricing water properly. And that was a really key development, and it's still ongoing in Australia now. That 1994 National Water Reform Agenda led us on a pathway towards establishing the right price and value for water in Australia, a key reform that many countries struggle with. How we achieved that was we have what we call a Council of Australian Governments, which is made up of the Prime Minister of Australia and the premiers or chief ministers of each of the states or provinces. They make decisions and enter into agreements in the national interest, and water was one of those issues that was brought to attention of the COAG agenda. The National Reform Agenda required the states to actually commence a journey towards improving their microeconomic reform of water, and it recognised that all of the states were at different levels and different starting points in that journey, and provided the opportunity for states to report back to COAG on an annual basis on their progress against achieving the reforms under the National Water Reform Agenda. This was really important because it was extremely difficult to say to every state, you must achieve X, Y, and Z by a certain date, when they all had very different starting points, very different capacities to pay for the kind of reforms that were necessary and resources available to them. And they also had very differing political climates. And so it was difficult for some jurisdictions to negotiate some of these reforms through their political climate. So 10 years on in the National Water Reform Agenda, and we started to see some significant changes in the way people valued water, how states valued water, and how we could price for water and therefore invest in infrastructure. In 2004, after 10 years of the National Water Reform Agenda, the Australian governments again came together and decided that there was still unfinished business, and they agreed on a new National Water Initiative. And the new National Water Initiative took the water reform journey to the next stage. And it looked at, in particular, a number of principles under which water could be better managed. And one of those was integrated basin-wide water catchment management, identifying where catchments were over-allocated and putting in place policies that would start the journey back to sustainable yields from the river systems. And it was a collective agreement on what the principles should be around water management. The key to this was when it's agreed at the national level and it's agreed by the Prime Minister and all of the states, when those chief ministers came back to their states, they could direct their ministers to actually comply with the agreement they'd signed off on. And those ministers then had someone else that they could blame for the reforms that they were putting in. And so it's always good to be able to blame the central government for something that you have to do. And it made the journey easier for state governments to be able to impose very unpopular policy reforms that were needed to ensure that our water reform journey was heading in the right direction. So all of that was happening and was chugging along very well in between 2004. And then the Millennium Drought started to kick in. Now, the Millennium Drought, to give you a little bit of detail on that, was a drought that went from about 2002 to 2012. It was a 10-year drought, and it was unprecedented. If you look at the diagram on the left, it shows you how serious the drought was, and that's where the Murray-Darling Basin is. That area of red is all the Murray-Darling Basin, and there were unprecedented drought records being broken year on year on year. The River Murray flows were the lowest in recorded history. Potable supply, water for people and towns and communities and critical human needs was actually being threatened for the very first time. And our agriculture sectors were decimated with inability to access water. It challenged our traditional approaches, and it also challenged the basic assumptions of our water supplies. We could no longer look at our historic data to forecast what might happen in the future. And we had created new norms and new lows. So this was a real taste of what climate change might look like for Australia. Just to further demonstrate that in this diagram, the River Murray inflows, this blue line here is the long-term average flows into the system. And these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines below that are 5 consecutive years, this being in the year 2006, 2007, where we flatlined in regards to flows into the River Murray system. Never seen anything like it before in the history of 117 years worth of data. The nice line at the top here was in 2010-11 when the drought finally broke and replenished our dams. But during those drought years, it was an opportunity for us to actually look at how we might fast track some of the reform policies that we were currently implementing, but they were taking a long time because they were very unpopular and we needed to bring our community along. To show you how devastating the drought was is just to show you this is how much our irrigators were allocated water during those years. So this year in 2007, 2008 and 2008, 2009, they started their water year with an estimation of only having 2% of the water that they would normally have available to them, and it rose to 18% by the end of the year. And so to operate your water business on 18% of your allocation is extremely difficult, and of course there was an enormous amount of hardship. So what we did during that period of time, and I always say to my political colleagues that you should never let a good crisis go by. A good crisis gives you that opportunity for step change in the reform journey. And we had been moving along this reform journey for some time. But what this enabled us to do was to actually say, right, we need to rethink the way in which we do this as a nation. And in 2007, our Prime Minister put out a proposition to the states that we should centralise the management of water with the federal government. This required the states to actually cede powers to the national government in certain areas to manage some components of the water reformer journey. Not all functions were transferred to the government, but some functions were transferred. And during this period of time, there was an enormous amount of water stress, and we were negotiating between the states for every single drop of water that was available. I sat on the Ministerial Council of the Murray-Darling Basin, and every month we negotiated every single drop. We borrowed from future potential inflows. We borrowed from states to actually provide for critical human needs, and then divided up what was available left over after we'd supplied critical human needs to irrigation. And so during that time, the federal government put on the table 10 billion, which rose to 13 billion by 2008, dollars to actually support this national framework and a new agenda for the Murray-Darling Basin, and in particular to establish what we call the Basin Plan. Now, the Basin Plan between 2008, when the federal legislation finally went through the National Parliament, took a further 4 years to negotiate between the states. It was very hard-pressed and hard-fought negotiations, but finally it was agreed that we would implement a Basin Plan at the national level. The plan is currently under implementation phase and is expected to be fully implemented next year. By next year. It doesn't mean that it's been an easy journey. This has been a very, very difficult journey in Australia, and it is still extremely unpopular in many, many areas of Australia. The reason why it's unpopular is because the environmentalists don't think enough water is being returned to the environment. The irrigators think too much water is being put back into the environment. The politicians are using it as a football and a political football when elections come around. Economists think too much money is being spent to support irrigators and not enough is being spent to support buying water back for the environment. The social scientists believe that regional communities have not been supported well enough during the change process. So everyone's got a reason to be unhappy about the Basin Plan. So from a political perspective, I think we've probably got it just about right, because if we had one sector really happy about it, the balance wouldn't be quite correct. But it means that you've got to stay the course, stick the line, and you've got to get the political climate to enable the politicians to stick to the plan. So back in 2008, when we put this legislation through the federal parliament, we actually put legislation through each of the state parliaments at the same time. It was enabling legislation. It means to undo this Basin Plan now, it needs to go through 11 different parliaments, which is highly unlikely. So the Basin Plan principles are likely to stick and see the long term because of that process of having to go through so many parliaments. So what does the plan do? It sets the overall environmental management objectives and outcomes. It sets new sustainable diversion limits. So it actually says to make it sustainable, to make water secure for everyone, we need to have a certain amount of water left in the river to keep the river healthy so that water where it's being extracted for whatever use is extracted and it's fit for purpose. So the sustainable diversion limit is an adjustment mechanism which allows the reclaiming of water to put back into the river system to sustain a healthy working river. There are a number of other more complex components to it. The Basin Plan sustainable diversion limit can be adjusted, and there are mechanisms to adjust it as new information becomes available. And if you go onto the Murray-Darling Basin Authority website, you can get more details about the adjustment mechanisms and the details of the plan. But basically, it's about resetting the balance, and it's about managing the water to ensure that it's fit for purpose. It sets out the requirements that states need to undertake in developing their own water sharing plans within the states. So the states still have a strong responsibility for what they need to do, and they must comply with the Basin Plan. So each of the catchments and each of the rivers within the Murray-Darling Basin catchment must have their own water plan and their water sharing plan alongside that, and that must be consistent with the national plan. There's also a new mechanism to manage critical human water needs, and for the first time, critical human water needs have been considered in the Murray-Darling Agreement. As I said previously, it was navigation and irrigation which were the primary drivers of those agreements in the past. It also sets out the rules for water trading and better access to water markets through the microeconomic reforms in Australia since the 1990s. We've introduced markets for water, and those markets for water have enabled people on the land and irrigators to be able to manage their water very differently and for water to trade through to a higher value of production. So, key elements to the Basin Plan and how did we do it? Science and monitoring. They are the key underpinner to all of this work that we've undertaken. Having independent scientific assessments of sustainable extraction limits has created the opportunity for us to have a conversation with the community that's very different to the conversation that was being had with the community before. Sharing the use of scientific data and actually investing in that data as part of that $13 billion that the federal government put on the table was a significant fund to support in the better understanding of our water systems. So a significant research effort was undertaken, and it used multiple science forums, and multiple scientists were engaged to actually do this process. And it wasn't just the science of the environment, it was the science of the economy and the social sciences to go with it. So the community engagement was a critical component of this. The initial plan that was released as a guide to the plan to demonstrate what a plan could look like was not received very well by communities, and in fact it was piled up out the front of one of the public meetings and burnt at the stake. So the plan, when it first came out, was very unpopular. And from that first guide to the plan, a series of community engagement occurred right and up and down the length of the Murray-Darling Basin to get the buy-in from the community with the scientists and with the policymakers. And the final product was adopted and accepted in 2012. That included many, many workshops, lots and lots and lots of communication, lots of regular forums, access to economic impacts and social impact assessments, as well as the environmental impact assessments. Then we also put in place some very significant monitoring and evaluation programs, because if you're going to introduce reform like the reform that we introduced in the Murray-Darling Basin, you have to be able to demonstrate to the community that the reason why they did this reform and how the reform was done is actually delivering the results that you expected it to deliver. So investment in monitoring and evaluation is often the forgotten science that brings down policy reform agendas. So a significant investment in monitoring and evaluation is necessary to maintain community confidence in the policy reform. So we have broad monitoring frameworks, regular data collection on a range of variables, and as we learn more about the basin and the way in which it reacts to environmental watering and reducing the amount of water that's taken out for extraction, we can then go back and revisit the plan and make the adjustments necessary to ensure that the Basin Plan is always well informed by the best available science. There were many complementary planning initiatives that the state governments undertook concurrently with the Basin planning process, and they included the water allocation plans, water demand and supply plans for urban communities, environmental watering plans, so that when we had this water that was going back into the system, how are we going to manage it to the best effect, and how do we engage with the community to ensure the environmental watering in their districts was delivering what they wanted it to deliver. We also introduced stormwater management plans and water quality improvement plans in our cities and our towns. So from that introduction to the Australian circumstance, I think the message is quite clear that basin planning was what underpins the reform journey, and it enables evidence-based for decision making. Politicians need to have good evidence to base their decisions on, and to be able to argue the case for a national approach to how you manage the cross-boundary and jurisdictional issues. Basin planning actually paves the way for the interjurisdictional dispute resolution, and it's the policy tool that brings everything together. So in doing the basin planning and in that managing the conflicts, in every context in the water sector, there are increasing demands. There's increasing demands on the development in the irrigation area. There's urbanisation, population growth, industry growth, big dam proposals for hydroelectricity. What are the third-party impacts that can occur there? Climate change, variability. How do you manage water systems where the variability is increasing? What are the interjurisdictional interests? Are they international, national, or interprovincial? What kind of disasters are we now seeing that are intensifying? What are the flood-induced disasters? What are the fire, the bushfire, the other kind of disasters that are on the horizon as a consequence of climate change? What are the relationships between groundwater and surface water, and how do we introduce conjunctive management into that sector? Also, what are the water quality needs? What is the fit for purpose water, and how do you put in place the policies to ensure the water you are providing is treated and of a fit for purpose quality for that need? So it's a conceptual model design, basin planning, and it starts at the top of the catchment and goes all the way to the bottom. And it includes making provision for changes in climate, for rainfall, for snow, for ice, surface groundwater, water quality, the river systems modelling, so modelling your inflow and your stream activity, your biophysical modelling, your ecosystem modelling, and importantly, your socio-economic modelling. What's the potable water requirements? What's the sanitation and hygiene requirements? How much do you need for hydropower? Where does agriculture, irrigation and fisheries compete for the same limited resources? And what are the ecosystem services that you want that river system to deliver? And then on top of that, you've got all of the social and cultural benefits that need to be factored in as well. So you can see with a basin-wide and a basin planning conceptual model design such as the one demonstrated here, all of those matters which are not just water related need to be considered to be able to manage that resource effectively. So finding the right sustainable solutions for managing water, including how you deal with the cross-jurisdictional and transboundary issues, is not to focus on it being just an engineering problem. And very often, the engineering problem is the one that comes first. And I've seen so many times where there's been significant investment in irrigation delivery systems without a concurrent investment in the people that will be using that water supplied by that system. Are they being helped to be better business people? Are we lifting them out of poverty by creating and providing for them the capacity to use different business models and different avenues to market? Are we doing the concurrent regional development policies to assist those farmers to be able to better utilise that water and therefore use less of it more efficiently to improve their production levels? Because water reform it's just as much about changing human behaviour and human culture as it is about technological solutions. Governments that actually couple their policy reform with infrastructure investment deliver those long-term solutions, and they are always difficult to implement, and they will always be contested, and they will always be cross-jurisdictional, cross-boundary, but also cross-political cycles, cross-political parties. But sustainability equals prosperity. And having that sustainability in the way in which you manage your water resources will lead to prosperity and will lead to lifting people out of poverty. It requires a multidisciplinary approach. It's not just about the engineers, although the engineering solutions are really important. In any policy reform where you involve the economics and the social sciences, you can have a much, much more sophisticated solution, and you'll also have a much greater chance of the reform sticking. Politicians need good science to underpin their decision making. They need to be informed well so that they can bring their communities along on a reform journey with them. Politicians need to build the acceptance for the need for change. The communities need to understand why this is being imposed, why it is necessary to do this policy reform. They need to understand that the benefits of the change can lift their lives, can change the way in which they can support their families, can improve their profitability on their farm. And they also need to know what the risks of not changing are. So staying the same is not an option, because if they stay the same, they're going to go backwards, and they need to understand that. They need to understand that well. And you can only bring that understanding through building capacity in those communities to better understand the dynamics of what's happening with their water, with the water system, and the bigger picture in which they fit into. Information based on evidence from good science provides the common language for these discussions. And scientists have traditionally been not very good at selling their science to the general public. And in Australia, we focused a lot on making sure that we brought that science into a language that our communities could understand. And when communities change behaviour concurrently with infrastructure investment, you get greater prosperity and long-term sustainability will prevail. And science is needed to inform that evidence-based decision-making all the way through. So basin planning is not just about, looking after the environment. It's about creating a secure environment for infrastructure investment. So if you think about water security rather than water planning or environmental water, think about water security as the economic enabler of prosperity. So everything you do with water, whether it be water for your cities, for your livability of your cities, for your health of your communities, for the prosperity of your irrigation communities, for your fisheries, whatever you do with water and you look at securing the supply of that water, that's the economic enabler that will underpin prosperity of your jurisdiction. Basin planning is the underpinning of this. It's the implementation of sustainable policy can only occur if you have very good basin planning and that you've actually created the opportunity to bring your community, your decision makers, your government agencies along on the journey. Another thing in Australia that we did very, very well was we actually connected our policymakers with our researchers, with our industry innovators, and created the environment for innovation to be what drove the policy reform agenda also. So water security creates the certainty for long-term investment and not only for governments, but for irrigators and for the broader private sector. So you create the policy environment for the private sector to invest in through having good, sound principles of management of water. So the key messages that I'd like to leave you with my presentation are that transparency in good science and capacity development underpins the process for conflict resolution. You've got to expand your thinking beyond the conventional engineering solutions, seek knowledge and understanding beyond your field, and be prepared to engage a multidisciplinary approach. Knowing the bigger picture and seeking to mitigate third-party impacts is critically important and prevent unintended consequences that arise from ill-informed decisions. Also engaging with communities and seeking to build not only infrastructure but the community capacity to sustain it is critical. And you need to be ready to respond to crisis because that is the accelerator for change. And understand that lasting reform does take time. So those are my key messages, and I hope that that through that presentation, you've seen an understanding of the criticality of not only just the engineering solutions, but the multidisciplinary approach to water reform. Thank you.
Well, that was excellent, Carleen. We really appreciate your insight that you gave to us. Many countries all over the world experience the same problem, and you pointed out that Australia has faced many challenges over the years and has needed to change the way it thinks about water in order to build resilience. And it was eye-opener for me, but not surprising, that science plays a significant role in this whole process. That creates an enabler or evidence-based decision-making to underpin the transboundary negotiations and the impact for community behavioural change. And as you said there at the end, your key messages, thank you very much for that as well, that through basin planning, it can create water security, which becomes an economic enabler of prosperity by creating confidence for long-term investment by governments, irrigators, and the private sector. So thank you very much for that enlightening presentation, and we trust that everybody around the world learned something about that. I'm not sure whether Ashwin or Central Office will like to say something, and then we can close off. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you, Carleen, for a very good presentation. Now we have received 2 questions through chat, which we have forwarded to you. If you are not able to see, then we can read out from here. And then we request all the participants to send their question through chat. And then in some cases, we will be able to give the speaking rights also to some of the participants if they raise the hand. And we'll see that who is raising the hand, and accordingly we'll give the speaking rights to them. Otherwise, questions can be sent through chat, which will be forwarded to the Ms. Caroline, and then she will answer those questions. So if you are able to see 2 questions, then you can start answering those questions.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll read it out.
Okay. This is Wenling Wang. What is the international and national interest conflicts over the basin? There's the question.
Well, the national interest conflict over the basin is that the states who have the majority of the basin in them, which is, I'll go back to the slide, which is New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland are the upstream states. They had a policy to allocate water within their jurisdictions that wasn't linked to the other states. So therefore their decisions were made in isolation, and it meant that down the end of the system, the river started to suffer. And the environment started to suffer, and the capacity to supply people downstream became problematic. So the national interest was to ensure that all jurisdictions had fair and equitable access to the waters of the Murray-Darling Basin, that the rules were there to support a fair and equitable share for all. The national interest, of course, was very hard to come to terms with for those jurisdictions who were used to making their own decisions and didn't want anyone else interfering in their decisions. So having the federal government put a lot of money on the table and decide that they wanted to see a more national approach, and convincing our state premiers, which are equivalent to chief ministers, to agree that national interest in water was critically important, was the starting point there for the resolution of those conflicts.
And same person, one more question. The community has been changing over the concept of water uses. How current political system react?
Well, the current political system in Australia is always reacting to the Basin Plan and is always looking to improve the Basin Plan and are consistently engaging with communities. The engagement didn't stop after the plan was first commenced implementation. It is an ongoing process to keep communities informed about what is happening within the Basin Plan, and to also ensure that the changing dynamics within the system can be accommodated.
We got another young professional in the name of Pawan Kumar Reddy. He says it is a good topic and every country is facing problem like this. In India also, Kaveri Basin is also having same situation. In the first side, you have mentioned that no consideration of downstream impacts, which means no need to consider the downstream side.
Yes, in that opening slide, I mentioned that there was no consideration of the downstream users, which was a consequence of the states having the rights to manage water, and they had no consideration of any of the jurisdictions that were downstream of them. So, for example, in Australia, we have the upstream states of Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, and the downstream state of South Australia. And South Australia's interests were not considered. Once the national plan was established, an agreement to actually deal with the national approach to water management, everyone's issues were then put on the table and collectively discussed, collectively managed, and collectively decisions were made, which made a big difference to how the river was managed in those upstream states.
Thank you. We have Mr. Srinivas from Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, with us. He's also attending this webinar in our office. So he has one or two questions. So I'll request Mr. Srinivas to raise his query.
Good evening, I guess. It's actually a fascinating presentation. This is one of the first presentations where there is a clear articulation of historical path dependency of the reforms that happened in Australia. Our challenge, I mean, the question that one of the participants raised about in issues like and other kind of interstate disputes. The challenge is to right now to articulate the federal government's role in facilitating agreements or decisions by the tribunals. Now, the notion is that the states have exclusive rights on the on water resources. Now, how does federal government articulate and delineate its role in this changed situation? Australia has had a history of more than 100 years. We are talking about 70 years for Murray Commission to become Murray-Darling Commission, and then another 10 years for the water reform agenda. And then you have this very interesting institutional innovation, which I don't think we have adequately nurtured in India, the Council of Australian Governments, which has the Prime Minister and the Chief Minister coming together and saying that this is how we need to reorganize our roles. Now, that kind of path dependency is often neglected in the discourse that we have about this engaging with water conflicts. So, how do you think? I mean, what I would like is to give a better sense. You also mentioned about the crisis is the catalyst for the reform.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to wait for the crisis in these kind of situations, but obviously you will be looking for the processual learnings about what really led to this kind of institutional processes that you mentioned. And if you could articulate about it, and you were at the center of this article, this process apparently as a minister during that drought period. So if you could talk about that process itself, how do you get together these variety of interests from provinces to agree to certain kind of process going about it?
Well, from an Australian context, it's taken a long time to get that agreement between the states and the Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth government, our central federal government of Australia, really needed to take strong leadership in this area, and to do that they needed to put a lot of money on the table. There is no better way to bring states to the table to negotiate outcomes than giving them a bucket of money to access. And so that's what led to the major reforms that created the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. During the history of Australian reform, at each of those times where we've seen a significant step forward in the decision-making in regards to the water reform journey, has been accompanied by a significant investment from the federal government in either research or infrastructure or some other investment to support the reform journey. It doesn't happen in isolation. States won't come to the table if they can't see that there's nothing in it for them.
Yeah, actually, Mr. Wang has already been replied some question, but he has still something to ask, and he has raised the hand. So we are giving speaking rights to him so that he can raise his questions directly to you.
Thank you.
Wang?
Mr. Wang?
It is unmute. Please unmute from your end.
Are you there, Mr. Wang?
It's okay, ma'am.
Yeah,
he's not responding. Yes. Okay.
Okay, then Mr. Pandya, you have to say something before we close.
No, that's fine. I mean, I'm almost in complete agreement with what she said, because I am also a very strong proponent of the idea that the dialogue, if at all any, has to be an informed dialogue, and unless it is based on science, the dialogue cannot succeed. So from that angle, I fully agree with her. The only issue is that when, in case of India, we have got too many political players. Unfortunately, we don't have a two-party system. We have a multi-party system where party numbers can go up to any level. So, bringing the people together, especially at the political level, what we see is that the people who are in power see up to their end of tenure. I mean, like if they say that my elections are going to be in 2019, then that is the end of the world. I don't know what happens beyond 2019, so I will only fight till 2019. So how do you create community pressure so that the people have a tendency to look at the long term rather than this kind of extremely short term visions?
Well, the way they did it in Australia was to put $13 billion on the table and say to the state governments, come to the table and talk about it now. And when you have $13 billion and the treasurers of each of those states want their hands on their fair share of that money, they will come to the table to talk with the federal government. The federal government does not give them the money unless they agree to certain conditions. Now, you have to recognise in that context, though, that every state and every jurisdiction, or every province, will be at a different starting point, and they will have different priorities in their political environment. So the principles in which you get the states to join up to the agreement on must be broad enough that everybody can show some success. You've got to be able to demonstrate success in each of the jurisdictions. So the principles of the National Water Initiative were broad enough that it enabled states that were well advanced in their water reform journey to be able to still show good progress and be rewarded for doing so. And for states where it was more difficult politically, they were still able to show progress, but at a different rate. And so they were rewarded for that progress as well. So it was recognising that you could not expect it all to happen at the same pace across all jurisdictions because it's not possible politically. Some parliaments, for example, the National Water Initiative 2004, one of the parliaments in Western Australia still has not been able to get their legislation through that parliament. But what they have been able to achieve is progress by actually implementing policies that create an environment where they're demonstrating their progress towards the national reform journey. And so they're rewarded for that. There's also the other side of it where the federal government at one point in time to actually kickstart the process or also put in place penalties. So if you did not show progress, then you did not get the money. And that's a very strong motivator, particularly when your treasurer in your government has already put that money in the forward estimates. And if it's already in the forward estimates, then they want to make sure that that water minister delivers the policy, and it creates the dynamic for it to change.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Srinivas has just to share a couple of things.
It's a clarification, ma'am. Could you please tell us a little bit more about how the Council of Australian Governments has come into? Is it a constitutionally mandated one, or otherwise is it something that came exclusively for the purpose of resolving the crisis that we had?
Well, it didn't come about because of water. The Council of Australian Governments was established many decades ago to deal with matters of national interest, which included the economy, included competition policy, it includes energy, it includes transport and infrastructure and those sorts of things. And in actual fact, water is not currently on the agenda for COAG because it's being managed through other means now. But COAG deals with the national interest issues of the time. And there are 8 major issues that they have currently on their agenda, one of which is energy and infrastructure, and water sort of is a subset of that one. So the Council of Australian Governments once again came around about through the microeconomic reforms that the national government wanted to put in place. Things like monetary policy and the corporate governance and company management needed to be at the national level, but it was invested in the states according to the Constitution. So to get the states to agree to transfer their powers to the Commonwealth and delegate that responsibility to the Commonwealth government for the national interest, it was managed through this COAG process. So the COAG was established not just for water, it was established for all national interest policies for the benefit of Australia.
Thank you.
Mr. Wang has now he's live and he can speak. We can give him a few minutes, 2 or 3 minutes to speak about his questions or query or clarification session. And then after that, we will be closing it. So Mr. Wang, now you can raise your question.
Yeah, my question is, after the 13 billion spent, what's the money will be support the Basin plan, and what do you think about future of Murray-Darling River Basin?
The Murray-Darling River Basin is still hotly contested. There's still a lot of people who are not happy with the Basin Plan, and it is still very much a controversial issue in Australia. But it is embedded in all of the parliaments, and it is being rolled out, and there is still a commitment to deliver the plan on time and in full. There are some issues which are really on the periphery that are still causing difficulty, and they get a lot of attention with the media, and they cause a lot of difficulty for politicians. But for politicians to be able to change the Basin Plan, as I said earlier, it has to go through 11 different parliaments, which means they have to get it through their own parliament, lower and upper house. And the likelihood of that happening is very, very low. So the plan has been locked in by the mechanisms in which we agreed to give powers to the Commonwealth and the way in which we implemented the Basin Plan through mirroring legislation in each of the states. And that's the key to the success of the plan. There will always be controversial issues around the Basin Plan, and they will have to be resolved at different times with different outcomes. But the fundamentals of the plan are locked away. And we will know whether or not we're successful in the next little while when the monitoring and the assessment of the programs that we've got in place to manage the environment demonstrate that the water in our river systems is of the quality that we hope it will, and the environment has been returned to the level of recovery that we've set about in our targets.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Brown.
Ma'am, may I request you to send us this PowerPoint presentation to us so that we can share it on our website?
Yes. Yes,
in the end, I thank Dr. Felix Renders for joining from South Africa and giving his opening remarks and then his views about the topic and the webinars. I thank Ms. Caroline Maywald, who has taken time to give this webinar, which was very interesting and very informative, at least for the developing countries, especially for India. There are a lot of transboundary disputes are taking place, and a lot of tribunals are already set up and they have given the award. Still, some tribunals are in the process of looking into the problems. So thank you, Madam, very much for giving this very informative webinar. I thank Mr. Pandya to join from Raipur. He is on a mission, so he joined from there. I joined all the participants who have joined and raised the questions, and very valuable questions were raised by them, which gave further information on. And then I'm seeing that from South Africa, a lot of creative have joined the webinar along with Dr. Felix Renders. Thank you very much for all the participants, and we'll be putting this recording of the webinar on our website, which can be accessed by anybody, and then it can be downloaded or it can be seen that for wider dissemination. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Felix Renders, and thank you all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you to ICID. Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.